The 1970s was arguably the single most important decade in the history of watch development and really the history of timekeeping altogether. On Christmas of 1969, Seiko released a watch that was the culmination of 10 years of development called the Astron, and it changed how watch movements would be made and how time would be kept forever. Powered by the first quartz movement, this watch promised accuracy of plus or minus 0.2 seconds per day, roughly 100 times more accurate than the best mechanical watches. This would kick off what many call the quartz crisis. Now, that term is really only sensible from the lens of those manufacturers wishing to keep the status quo. In any other industry, this would simply be the greatest innovation ever. But watchmakers and enthusiasts are strange people, and especially those manufacturers working out of Switzerland, they were scared, and for them, it certainly was a crisis. Complicated, beautiful mechanical timepieces, their bread and butter, were in danger of becoming things of the past. To put this into perspective, by the 1980s, the Swiss watch industry had fallen from its historic 85 million watches sold in 1974 to roughly 30 million per year by the early 80s, and the industry had lost over 60,000 jobs. But was this sort of recession just the fault of quartz movements? In Pierre-Yves Danze's brilliant book on this subject, he points out that it was more than just the invention of quartz-powered watches. It was more than just an unwillingness to adapt to the times and catch up. Companies like Timex had already began producing incredibly cheap but durable mechanical watches, and that would definitely take a hit out of the Swiss watch industry. 1979 would mark the first year, actually, that quartz watches would overtake mechanical watches in sales. It's not as though quartz watches just instantly took over the industry. A company like Seiko, for example, kept making and promoting mechanical watches. The point is, there still absolutely was a market for what the Swiss had to offer, and yet their sales fell rapidly. In many ways, their problems ran so much deeper than quartz versus mechanical. It was the way these companies ran their businesses that was the problem, and something drastic had to be done. Like most stories from watch history, it starts with the cartel, the Swiss watch cartel, that is. In the early 20th century, a new Swiss law called Status Horologer, or watchmaking statute, set to protect Swiss watchmaking. This law essentially helped to protect what the Swiss were doing, and it kept these companies small. It prevented Swiss manufacturers from selling their parts abroad, and it sort of forced the big manufacturers to make their own movements. From Longines to Patek to Rolex, Swiss manufacturers were to make their own calibers, and this helped bring about the cartelization of the Swiss watch industry, especially with the group ASUAG and also SSIH. But as the quartz crisis got underway, and as Japanese watchmakers, with their emphasis on quality and their ability to mass produce effectively, they were slowly taking chunks out of the Swiss's market share. This old school model that these companies worked under wasn't going to work for long. I mean, how is a company like Omega going to keep competing in every single segment with every single kind of watch imaginable, while Seiko and Timex had figured out how to take specific watch models, for example, from their catalog and absolutely mass produce them with modern production lines and conveyor belts? Swiss companies, on the other hand, were still operating like it was the 1930s. How are they going to keep up in terms of sales in places like America, where quality Japanese watches could be had for a fraction of the price? If you're a fan of automotive history, there's quite a bit of overlap at this time with the way the Japanese motorcycle and car manufacturers really showed up the British in attacking the American market with cheaper but actually higher quality products. In some ways, the same thing was happening with watches. By the 1980s, these two main groups, that is ASUAG and SSIH, these groups were controlling basically the entire Swiss watch industry, alongside Swiss banks, really. And yeah, these companies were all failing. And so the banks turned to this guy, Nicolas G. Hayek. Hayek had spent the last 2 decades as a consultant for industrial firms, and what he saw in these two major groups owning all of these companies, it wasn't good. All of these single companies within these groups, though they were a part of the groups, they essentially operated independently. Everyone had their own production, their own supply lines, their own marketing teams. It was a giant crap show. He proposed a new single watch group that would consist of ASUAG and SSIH joining, and more importantly, this would be the formation of SMH, later Swatch, the single largest watch group in the world. Joining these two groups was no simple task, but by the end of the 80s, the Swiss watch industry was back to making massive profits. Here's the other thing, though, that can't be overstated. Hayek, unlike so many, was a watch guy. Shocking, right? Now, legend tells of a simple story to explain Hayek and the Swatch Group's success in the face of almost complete collapse. A simple plastic quartz watch known as the Swatch. Created and developed by a team of ETA engineers, this little $40-ish watch would become so much more than just a cheap, cute timepiece. It created a sort of lifestyle brand. Unlike traditional Swiss watches that focused more on luxury, Swatch introduced bold, colorful designs that changed with seasons. They were marketed as fun, collectible sort of fashion accessories, not just timepieces. And the company used aggressive celebrity endorsements and sports sponsorships and pop culture collaborations. And the production of the Swatch watch was also revolutionary. It was the first watch ever to be made entirely automatically. Even though the Swatch was a cheap plastic little piece of junk, I mean, it really was, it was still entirely made in Switzerland and was a true Swiss watch. It was also a revolutionary watch. And the story goes that the success of the Swatch made it possible for Hayek and the Swatch Group to essentially rescue the Swiss watch industry and make it competitive again. Here's the thing though. The money made from this little fashion piece is really only a small part of the story. It's not so much about the extra chunk of money that came from the Swatch watch to just dump at these companies. More than anything, what happened was the Swatch proved to those at the top that this organization could set out to develop new relevant watches, ones that told stories and that could be marketed to the world as a whole. So why couldn't the Swatch Group set out to do that with all of these other brands? Because all of these brands had heritage and had stories to tell. While Swatch watches dominated the lower end of the market, Hayek also had a long-term vision for luxury Swiss watchmaking. He rightly understood that Swiss mechanical watches could not compete with quartz on, price and accuracy. So instead he focused on repositioning them as high-end, artisanal, and luxurious. Several key Swatch Group brands saw really a complete transformation under this strategy. In the early 80s, Omega, for example, was struggling, losing its market identity to brands like Rolex. Under Swatch Group, Omega underwent a massive sort of repositioning. Omega signed major brand ambassadors like Cindy Crawford and George Clooney, and of course later Daniel Craig as James Bond. Of course, the introduction of coaxial escapements was really important for Omega. Developed by George Daniels, this really set Omega apart from its competitors by offering higher efficiency, reduced friction. And then of course there's Longines, which found its niche as kind of a mid-tier luxury brand, positioned below Omega, but still remaining a competitor even to Omega in many people's eyes, offering refined, traditional designs with strong historical heritage. Swatch Group really helped Longines expand its lineup, of course with the Master Collection, the Hydro Conquest dive watches, and, the revival of lots of important heritage pieces. One brilliant move Swatch made with companies like Omega and Longines was to significantly lower the amount of different models available from these companies, to simplify things. Less is more, I guess. Then, of course, there's Blancpain, which had ceased operation in the 70s, but Swatch Group saw an opportunity to bring it back as kind of a premier high-end mechanical watchmaker, and they did that in 1992, and the brand embraced its slogan, "Since 1735, there has never been a quartz Blancpain watch, and there never will be." Still, Swatch helped Blancpain focus on traditional, hand-finished movements and complications. Of course, the 50 Fathoms dive watch became somewhat of a competitor to Rolex's Submariner. In many ways, Blancpain pioneered the resurgence of mechanical watch complications. Swatch brands began partnering with celebrities and athletes, and not just for, high-end like Omega pieces. Basketball players like Tony Parker partnered with Tissot, and even today we see celebrities like Henry Cavill recently joining Longines. Another key aspect of Swatch Group's impact was its control over movement productions. Through ETA SA, the Swatch Group became the primary supplier of mechanical movements to these Swiss brands, ensuring the Swiss watches remained independent from foreign movement suppliers, but things were just so much more simplified than they were, during the quartz crisis. The Swatch Group really tried to focus on modernizing production methods while still maintaining that level of craftsmanship and just prestige that was associated with Swiss watchmaking. One of Swatch Group's most revolutionary changes was its streamlined manufacturing process, which drastically reduced production costs and time while also benefiting both entry-level and, their luxury brands. They consolidated movement production under ETA, allowing for standardized and cost-efficient manufacturing of movements for brands across the portfolio from Tissot to Omega. And by developing these versatile, interchangeable movement components, Swatch Group was able to facilitate mass production without really sacrificing quality. While hand-assembled watches remained a key feature for high-end brands like Breguet and Blancpain, Swatch Group implemented automation in the production of components, things like balance wheels, and they reduced labor costs without compromising precision. All of these concepts kind of center around the idea of what luxury is. What is a luxury watch? I think we all define luxury differently, but for many, $500 on a watch is an unthinkable luxury. For others, it's $50K. For me, it's always been this. If a watch costs the same as a decent running vehicle, it's definitely a luxury piece. And I can get a decent running vehicle for pretty cheap. One thing Swatch did in the 80s with their brands was make a distinction between exclusive and affordable luxury. The former is reserved for the absolute social elites, whereas the latter is kind of a broader category for a broader audience. This made it possible for Swatch companies to market their products truly as luxury watches, as luxury products, and this really shows in their advertising, but they didn't always have to charge these exorbitant prices. It's not that Swatch Group didn't still focus on those kinds of exclusive luxury brands. Picking up Breguet and Blancpain and even Glashütte shows this. But positioning companies like Hamilton and Rado as true luxury brands but targeted more towards middle-class audience, it's brilliant. And for those of us who can't afford a $30,000 Breguet, it's great because we get to have a similar experience and feel like we're buying something special because that's how these watches are presented. Beyond innovative production techniques, Swatch Group also introduced key advancements in movement technology that helped restore the reputation of Swiss luxury watches. Of course, the coaxial escapement, but also uniform production techniques across different brands ensured consistency and allowed for brand-specific modifications and finishing touches. Swatch Group pioneered the use of silicone balance springs and other non-magnetic materials in brands like Omega and Breguet, but then these things would trickle down to companies like Tissot. And this really improved precision and durability. Omega, under Swatch Group, developed the METAS certification, which surpasses COSC standards in precision, anti-magnetism, and durability, positioning the brand as a leader in high-performance watchmaking. The 90s and 2000s would prove pivotal time periods for Swatch as they integrated new brand strategies and marketing and better production methods and distribution. A big part of their strategy in terms of distribution was tapping into markets in places like Thailand and India and Mexico, with companies like Rado becoming favorites in the Middle East, Tissot in the East in general. One thing that Hayek understood was the importance of Western manufacturing. He firmly believed that industries in the West shouldn't simply source out all of their manufacturing to the East, and even though Hayek died some 15 years ago, he was entirely right about the consequences of becoming so dependent on Eastern manufacturing, and his focus on making Swiss watches truly Swiss watches was so important. In 2010, Nicolas Hayek died. This man is officially credited with saving the entire Swiss watch industry. I mean, if you love Swiss watches today, you owe something to him. He truly was brilliant, and more than anything, the guy loved watches, which it may not seem obvious to most, but that is important if you're going to run a group of watch companies. Hayek really understood these different brands and how to let them be themselves. And today, the Swatch Group is run by Hayek's son and daughter. Swatch Group owns 16 brands from high-end companies like Omega and Blancpain and Glashütte and Jacques Drouot to mid-tier brands like Longines, though personally, Longines is up there with the best, I'm sorry. And of course, Hamilton and Mido and Tissot and Certina, to affordable brands, of course, Swatch and Flic Flac. Swatch Groups remain a dominant force with both high-end mechanical brands and mass-market quartz watches. Its influence on the industry is really immeasurable, and it continues to innovate in materials and movement technology and, of course, marketing, which, as we know in the watch industry, that's kind of everything. There's a sort of bookends to the Swatch story, from its inception as a group and the way they used a cheap, affordable plastic quartz pipe watch to help fund their work, to recently, of course, the introduction of the Moon Swatch, a plastic, cheap, not all that affordable hype watch. In all seriousness, there's so many similarities. Both watches did what watches are supposed to do best, which is tell a story, make you feel something, like you're being brought into something special when you get a watch, something almost timeless and intangible. I think what really stands out to me in looking at Swatch Group's history is their ability to take, say, a brand like Hamilton or Glashütte Original or Tissot or Longines and let that brand really tell its own story and celebrate its own history and heritage while supporting it by making it able to profitably design and craft unique watches. I mean, it's a simple way to put it, but that is no simple thing. When I first got into watches, I had no idea that these companies were all under the same group. And just balancing it all within a company so that there's not too much overlap and competition between brands, it's really genius. And for the most part, it's just good in general for the watch industry. You know, you wouldn't have the PRX today if it weren't for the Swatch Group. I'm not saying we all agree with every decision and direction taken by the Swatch Group. Of course, you know, it's a little sad companies like Breguet and Blancpain don't get treated necessarily as we all want them to be, but regardless, it really can't be overstated just how much the entire watch industry as a whole should credit Swatch for what they did and, you know, what they continue to do. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and we'll see you guys in the next one.